Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the China Manufacturing Decoded podcast. This is episode 106 already. And this is Renaud here, your host for today. And I'm going to be talking with Andrew Hupert, who I've been following for a while. He lived in China for many years. He actually wrote a few books, including one called the Fragile Bridge. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I still remember reading it. It was, 10 years ago or something.
Yeah,
and it illustrated so well the differences in thinking, and especially when it comes to deal making between a typical American party, let's say someone coming straight from New York City into China and dealing with someone in China who seemed to be very polished and used to the Western ways, but actually still thinks very much in a Chinese way, and all the conflict it can create. So that's a good little book, quick read. But anyway, to get back to the topic, Andrew is actually now in Mexico, has been for some time, and he is an expert in negotiating and how to say. I would let you introduce yourself, but the main topic of today is not really about manufacturing in China, but actually more about manufacturing leaving China and what is leading a lot of companies, especially American ones, to consider leaving China. So, hi, Andrew. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
I'm doing really well. It's great to be here. I've been reading you forever, for a very long time. So you're one of the first people I started reading when I was getting up to speed on manufacturing in China. So it's interesting that we're talking now when my view is that manufacturing is not necessarily leaving China, but it's spreading. It's moving to other places. I'm not saying that the China manufacturing economy is going to be a thing of the past. But and mostly I'm going to be speaking about, when I talk about the West, I'll be talking about the United States and Europe, especially Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. So for the West, for Americans and Europeans, it's necessary to diversify supply chains. It's necessary to move supply chain and to make redundant supply chains. Mm-hmm. That means you've got to start looking beyond China. Just a little bit of background. I moved to China. I moved to China proper. I lived in Shanghai. I started living in Shanghai in 2002, and I lived there until 2010. But prior to that, I had been living in Asia. To name the cities, I was in Hong Kong. I was in Taipei. I was in Kyoto in Japan. So I've been in Asia since about 1996. I had been in Greater China. And what I've noticed now is that so many people like me, so many Americans who have lived and worked and developed relationships in China now find it difficult to do business in other places. China made it very easy to do business in China, especially manufacturing, because those special economic zones and government policy, those 5-year plans, made it pretty integrated and pretty streamlined. And the extreme example of this is, of course, the Canton Fair, which used to be annual, but now I guess it's just ongoing, or several times a year. And it's a one-stop shop for international business. And when American manufacturers and American brands come to places like Mexico for the first time, one of the things that shocks them is that it's all DIY, it's all do-it-yourself. And I think that this is one of the big trends we'll be looking at as we look at what I've been calling Globalism 2.0.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And you explained that. Actually, you have a podcast called Globalism 2.0, right?
Yes.
Can you summarize a little bit what you call Globalism 2.0 and why 2.0?
All right. Globalism won. Globalism classic. For us, for people our age, historians will argue that globalism has been going on since the Bronze Age and before the Bronze Age. Let's talk about globalism as for us, people our general age, as globalism as starting after World War II. With the beginning of the WTO and the World Bank and, not WTO, but beginning of the World Bank and the United Nations, that began Globalism 1. Globalism or Globalism Classic. Globalism 1 was characterized by U.S. leadership, U.S. and European leadership, basically spreading their rules and their operating system around the world, and everyone else had to follow that operating system. And this was an outgrowth and an evolution of the old pre-World War II colonial system, where Britain had the empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That sort of gave way to this globalism 1.0, old classic globalism, where the U.S. made the rules. That ended. I don't know when exactly that ended. I'm sticking my my pin in the calendar at when was it? I think it was October 8th, 2020 or 2018. When did Mike Pence gave his speech at the Heritage Foundation starting the Cold War between U.S. and China? That pretty much ended globalism 1.0. The new globalism we're in, and globalism is going to exist. The United States may not be running things. The United States may not even be involved in the global economy after 2025. I don't think it's going to be that extreme, but that's the trend we're heading towards. Globalism is going to continue. It just may not it may not have the United States in a starring role or in a central policy-making role. So when I'm talking about globalism 2.0, what we're in now going forward, there are 5 big characteristics that I look at. Number 1, the U.S. leadership fades. U.S. leadership continues to fade from the global scene, regardless of internal politics. Even if there's a Republican, if there's a Democrat, it doesn't really matter. The U.S. is going to stop being the one and only authoritative voice in international trade. Number 2, we're going back to a period of spheres of influence. And when I first wrote this a few years ago, I was looking at Russia as potentially having a large sphere of influence. Clearly, that's fading. And the main ones are going to be U.S. and China. But what I'm seeing here is Latin America is emerging into is trying to emerge into a trading bloc. Southeast Asia is not going to have much of a choice but to strengthen ASEAN. Africa is trying to start a trade group. The EU is, of course, very active, and India is now becoming much more assertive in international, in forming its own sphere of influence. So we're going to go back to this period of a sphere of influence where people within your trade group get preferential treatment and duty-free imports and exports, and outsiders don't. Mm-hmm. Number 3, global institutions are crumbling and they're going to give way to these overlapping trade agreements. And this is what we're seeing in Asia now with CPTPP and with ASEAN and the new expanded ASEAN. Meanwhile, the WTO and World Bank are having less and less of an impact in the world. Mm. Now, this was the sanctions that the U.S. and Europe put on Russia after the Ukraine invasion. It's sort of a double-edged sword on this point. So if the point is that global institutions are fading, the United States and Europe sort of counterindicated here because they were very effective in leveling institutional sanctions on Russia, things, especially the SWIFT settlement system. So that would seem to argue that global institutions are still strong. But if you look at a map of who took part in these sanctions and who stayed out of these sanctions, most of the emerging world, most of emerging economies stayed out of the sanctions. And it's just the United States, Australia, and Europe that are leading the charge. So it's sort of, this might be the last gasp of the old global institutions, because now what China and to a lesser extent Russia are going to do are going to be are going to develop workarounds to these global institutions that are now being, I don't want to say weaponized, but are being used to implement policy. Number four, and this is another one we're seeing very well, technology is being increasingly politicized. And China gets this. I don't think the U.S. gets this. The U.S. is relying on a lot of private business to carry a lot of water for national policy. And Elon Musk is the one that comes to mind, where he's basically underwriting a lot of the United States space program. But he's a private individual, and he owns this technology. So technology is going to be increasingly politicized. And I think this puts the United States at a little bit of a disadvantage. We're also going to see huge competition among technical standards around the world. Right now, the United States and Europe and the UK tend to create all the technical standards that manufacturers have to follow and have to meet. And China wants that. China wants in on that standard setting, and they're making big moves. And the final one, and again, I think this favors China over the U.S. in the short term. Number 5 is the line between government and corporation is blurring away to nothing. And it's getting very, very hard to know who is a private actor, who is a government actor, and when. And in China, they've always been comfortable having the national champions, even when it put their business and their brand at risk, like with Huawei. China has always stood by its national champions. The United States has always had a different relationship between government and corporations. The government tends to not dictate policy to corporates in the United States. It's more of the opposite. The corporates tend to try to influence government policy in the U.S. So the United States may not benefit greatly from this shift in globalism, from the old style globalism, which was an extension of U.S. power, to this new globalism where it's much more anyone's game. It's up for grabs. And on the ground, China has a lot of this is China's to win or lose. China is in a pretty good situation right now to make gains during this new globalism. But China has always been its own worst enemy. So when just as things are looking good and China can, whatever empire in Chinese history you're discussing, just when things are looking good and you can expand and you can make progress, that's when things collapse. Yeah, so it's not a clear. There's no clear winner or loser in this, but this is how I see the development.
Yeah, and like every time you're right, or you speak about some of these mega trends, I'm always nodding my head. Yes. This sounds so true. Yes. But there's something that you said on one of your recent podcasts that are going to have a lot of importers, sit down and think, because this one might catch them by surprise. What is a bad scenario for American importers and in general, any company that has products manufactured in China and sold in the USA? What is a bad scenario in the next 2, 3, 4 years that they have to take into account in their planning? Can you talk about this a little bit?
My number one concern is adverse regulations. Bad regulations, and not the direct regulations, but the unintended consequences. And this is what we're seeing in the United States now, where in the United States right now, just about anyone in Congress can make a trade rule, can propose a law or a bill having to do with trade and having to do with U.S.-China trade. And ever since the Pence speech at the Heritage Foundation, the United States has been in a de facto Cold War with China. So we've been seeing lots and lots of regulations. We're seeing there are 3 classes of regulations that you need to be concerned about. One is old regulations that have sort of not been very diligently executed or imposed, things like most favored nation regulations, and just the Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts and the Foreign Investor Act. These have been on the books for forever, but no one's really followed them. And now you're going to see these things get ramped up. So if you are an importer, your compliance on existing laws is going to be high. You're going to be spending more money, spending more time, and spending more sanity trying to comply with existing rules that are being implemented in a new or more stringent way. Number two, however, is more dangerous, and this is the new rules. And a lot of these new rules are going to pop up, and we saw these under the second half of the Trump administration when they had whole classes of products that couldn't be imported, classes of products that couldn't be exported, and lots of new restrictions. I'm not talking about tariffs yet. That's class 3. So class 2 is going to be all these new rules, like you got to certify that your products aren't being made with slave labor from Xinjiang.
Right.
Okay. Where's the form for that? There is no form for that. What's the procedure for that? There is no procedure for that.
Yes.
Who makes the decisions about that? We don't know who makes the decisions about that.
Customs and Border, right? I guess in the U.S.
We don't know. We don't know or not. It could be customs. It could be immigration. It could be Treasury and finance. It could be the SEC. We have no idea. This is what I'm so concerned about. These politicians who have a base in rural United States or in urban United, doesn't really matter. They are now going. After 2022, after the midterm elections this year in November, the United States is there's a strong chance the United States is going to shift to a de facto one-party system where the only real political competition is not between Republicans and Democrats, but between Republicans and Republicans. And how are they going to compete? They're going to compete by being more and more MAGA, more and more America first. And who makes the easiest target for this? China.
Of course.
So if you want to impress your constituency in Arkansas, what do? You're going to make a rule that says any importer must certify that Christianity isn't being persecuted. Christians aren't being persecuted in the country of origin. Okay? Right. Where's the paperwork for that? Where's the form for that? Who makes the decisions on that? We don't know. So this is the big problem facing. I say American businessmen, but it's really everyone. But it's mostly American. If you're importing into the United States, you're going to have to comply with a lot of new rules that sounded good when they were announced in Washington, but are now a nightmare when you are trying to do the paperwork and you are trying to comply. And this is going to be your big problem. Compliance is going to be increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive. And that leads to number 3, the third set of problems, or the third set of new laws that Americans and Europeans have to worry about, which is the tariffs. Those tariffs that went on the books in the last administration, just about everyone agrees they're a bad idea and everyone agrees they're contributing to inflation, but they're not going anywhere. And there's no serious conversation to pull those tariffs off. And the only way they're going to pull those tariffs off is if a new Republican Congress replaces them with something more stringent or more expensive or more difficult. So I'm not really worried about an American or a European procurement manager coming to a deal with a Chinese factory manager. That, I think, is going to continue unabated. The problem is going to be getting your goods from the factory to the port in Ningbo or in Shenzhen, because on the Chinese side, you're going to have the same, you're going to have tit for tat regulations. For every bad American regulation, the Chinese will feel unpatriotic if they don't match it with a bad Chinese regulation. So
Well, it might be much clearer and much better targeted, right?
yeah, it'll still be bad though. It'll be clearer. You'll know why the shipment can't leave the factory, but the shipment still may not be able to leave the factory gates. And it's going to be the war of the bureaucrats. And in the war of the bureaucrats, the loser is the procurement and the procurement manager and the factory manager. We've reached a point where and I think this is probably occurring in Europe as well. Bad economics has become good politics, or bad international economics has become good domestic politics.
Right.
And I'm very concerned about this in the United States. I'm concerned about it in France too.
Yes, true. But it's been very, very clear in the US. I mean, I think everybody who watches and listens to the politicians, can feel that beating China up is always popular. They always earn points when they do that. That's the point, right?
Yeah, and right now the U.S. government is still split between Democrats and Republicans. Mm-hmm. After the midterms in November, there's a good chance it will be a much more Republican government.
Right.
And there's no one knows for sure, but there's a good chance that by first quarter 2025, we are looking at a Republican-controlled U.S. government. And then the competition is between Republicans who can come up with the toughest, most anti-China laws.
Right.
So we don't have that much time. And that's the subtext here. We're not, yes. You're nodding, I'm nodding. Everyone who's listening to us is nodding their heads going, yes, yes, yes. What I'm saying is we've got a timetable. We've got a timer on this. Mm-hmm. And by first quarter 2025, the situation between the U.S. and China could get just incredibly bureaucratic, incredibly expensive, and just not worth the profit.
Right. And someone might get, 5 containers being shipped and underwater, completely refused for entry into the U.S. for some obscure reason. Renaud, it's not even that. 2 boats in front of you might be having trouble, and your boat is doing circles in the outside of San Diego. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be you. It can be it could be someone in front of you online. That's how bad this situation is going to be. You have no control over your logistics anymore, or you won't after these new laws go into effect. Right. So in practical terms, so that means if you're listening to this podcast, if you sell a lot of products on the American market, have you already implemented China Plus One? And if not, what are you waiting for, basically, right? And
what are you waiting for?
And maybe if you're already at China Plus One, well, maybe the plus one, be it Vietnam, Mexico, or some other place, how to grow that so that most of the products are made in that other country, right? But what about, is it going to be targeted at products assembled in China? I guess it will also hit the products that are assembled, let's say in close to Hanoi, with 20 different parts coming from South China, because I've
been asking about this for years. No one knows.
Right.
The answer seems to be it depends on how picky the U.S. wants to be.
Yes. So to me, just forgetting about all these issues, all the changes that are going to happen based on your scenario, when I think of a company that buys a lot of components in China and have them assembled in another country, mm-hmm. to ship them and sell them in yet another country, that's already sort of nonsense to me, because the supply chain is longer, more complex. You're adding a lot of time, you're adding risks, and in some cases you are also adding costs. So just to say this is made in Vietnam, this is made in India, this is made in Mexico, in a lot of cases, it doesn't really make sense, except if you're working on relocating also the sources of these components, right? But I see a lot of companies that do the switch, that move assembly, but they don't really get to work on moving the components because it's just convenient. It's a lot of work to move an entire supply chain if your products have a long bill of material. So
if it's even possible, there are materials and there are processes that right now you can't source outside of China.
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of headaches for a lot of people, basically, right?
A lot of headaches, and unfortunately, they're non-economic. In the source of the problems is non-economic. If the factory managers and the buyers around the world would be able to sort out whatever problems they have, and that's what we're used to. We're used to dealing with Chinese factory managers and engineers who, when faced with a problem, will go off, smoke a couple of cigarettes in the stairwell, and come back with a workaround. There's no workaround to this. Okay?
Yeah, well,
there's no workaround to excess bureaucracy other than moving your supply chain.
Right. Do you see Vietnam as potentially a target?
I was living in Vietnam. Vietnam is, it's a big question mark. First of all, Vietnam, it's a good alternative to China, or it would have been a good alternative to China in like 2015. Vietnam is getting crowded. Oh, yeah. Vietnam is already full. They're not really looking for the kinds of small runs that made Shenzhen such a unique place. If you're, Samsung, Vietnam will accommodate you. If you're Apple, Vietnam will accommodate you. If you have a cool idea for a new pet accessory, not so much.
Right.
Now, the flip side, which is I think where you're going with this, will the U.S. start to apply these same laws and regulations to Vietnam? Or will the United States insist that even if your supply chain goes through Thailand and Vietnam, it doesn't contain any China components or materials? That is the big question.
Yeah, a lot of questions here, yes.
Could the U.S. do this? Yes, the U.S. could do this. And this is exactly the kind of unintended consequences I'm afraid of. Like right now, for instance, here's an example of the kind of thing this is what keeps me up at night. Mexico's economy is heavily dependent on its own trade agreement with United States and Canada. It's called the North American Canadian Mexico Agreement, or NACMA, or on the Mexican side of the border, it's called TMEC. There was a rule in NACMA or TMEC that says that no party of this treaty can sign a treaty with a non-market economy. This was supposed to be the anti-China clause of the NAFTA 2 or NMCA and North America, US. It's USMCA, USCMA, US Canada Mexico Agreement. So there is clause 32, paragraph 10 of USCMA says that no member of this treaty can do business with a non-market economy. And this was the anti-China clause of the USCMA. But Vietnam is a non-market economy as well. It's the U.S. is the only one that classifies this, but the U.S. classifies of the Asian economies, China and Vietnam are not non-market economies, and Mexico already, and TPP and Mexico already has an agreement with Vietnam. So it's very up in the air how picky the U.S. wants to be when it starts creating these new trade laws. But there's a lot to work with, and if the U.S. starts banning non-market economies, or if it starts banning anyone whose supply chain runs through China, it's going to be extremely disruptive for Southeast Asia.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And for you, for those of us that do business there.
Yes. Oh, yes. So what about Mexico? Because you've been there now for some time. Have you seen a lot of movement of supply chains out of Asia to Mexico for products that are sold in the USA and Canada?
I've heard more than I've seen, but I'm hearing a lot. Now, I'm out of it right now. I am down south. I'm in a smaller city. I'm just studying the language and studying the economy. Going up north to there's a program called IMEX, or the Maquiladora program. And the Maquiladora program is the closest thing Mexico has to a special economic zone. This is like an SEZ in China. So it's like Suzhou. But it's not a city. It is it's individual factories. So Mexico has set up this Maquiladora program, which is very good for companies that want to do business with the United States or Canada, because it allows for duty-free transport into the United States market and into Canada. The idea basically is, with the Maquiladora program, if you're an American brand, if you're a Ford, if you're General Motors, because that's who really makes use of it, you can ship your parts across the border into Mexico, and you can buy parts relatively duty-free from abroad for this factory and produce your finished good, produce your car, produce your truck, as long as that finished product is re-exported back to the United States or to another market. In other words, as long as you're not producing for sale in the Mexican market, the Maquiladora program allows you to import raw materials and components tax and duty-free, and gives you other trade protections and other legal protections that you simply don't get in outside of SEZs, outside of.
So this is in Tijuana, just behind San Diego. This is in Ciudad Juarez, just behind El Paso. This is the kind of places, right? Basically,
yes,
mostly along the border.
They cluster up around the border or around ports. There are some big ports that also attract a lot of maquiladoras. But they just cluster up and they form a region. But the legal authority resides with the corporation itself, with the IMEX company. So you can put an IMEX company just about anywhere, I think, but they tend to be near the infrastructure. And Mexico has great infrastructure in certain places, like along the border and along the ports. The ports tend to be very good, and then the cross-border highways are very good, and they're building a rail line as well. And they just expanded the Mexico airport. They just basically doubled the size. So infrastructure is pretty strong for, if you want to sell into the U.S. market.
Right. So talking about the political developments and in the U.S. and all the risks that it represents for a lot of companies, what about Mexico? Do they tend to try and favor Mexico just to hurt China? Or do they just not care?
Okay, it's not to hurt China. In China, if the government calls you an arrogant Westerner, you're done. That's the signal that you have overstepped. In Mexico, they have the same idea, but the phrase is exploiter. And if you're European or if you're American, you might be an exploiter. So that's who Mexico is taking aim at. Mexico and the rest of Latin America view China as the spoiler to American authority. Mexicans and Latin America have I'll say love-hate relationship with the United States, but it's not that much love. A need-hate relationship with the United States. So when they make these rules, they do it with an eye towards keeping the United States out. So Mexico has been, and the president, AMLO, Andres Marquez Lopez Obrador, or just AMLO, he has been on a nationalization kick. So he just nationalized the electric grid, the domestic one. Mm-hmm. He nationalized the oil industry, although that was already pretty nationalized before. And he just nationalized the lithium market. Lithium is one of those rare earth metals that China is so interested in because that's what drives, that's what powers, no pun intended, that's what powers mobile batteries. So all your mobile phones and in the future, all your electric vehicles are going to be powered by lithium. And that brings China, that's one of the things bringing China to Latin America. So all of Latin America views China with a mix of fear and admiration and optimism. They think that they can play China off against the United States. Mexico does this to a lesser extent than, say, Brazil or Argentina or Venezuela, but that is the role of China in this region. China has been very active with the Belt and Road Initiative in Central America and South America. Not so much in Mexico because of that rule in USCMA. So you won't see any BRI activities in Mexico. But Mexico is also teaming up with Latin America. Mexico is sort of trying to create a regional leadership role for itself. Others have tried this. It never really works. But Mexico is trying to create almost like a trade group for lithium exporters. That's going to put it in very close contact with China, because China is going to be very interested in the lithium and the rare earth metals markets in Latin America and Central America. And these countries tend to be, the Latin American countries, they tend to be very nationalistic and populist. They tend to be corrupt. They tend to be very, try to be independent of the United States. And that makes them perfect candidates for influence from Chinese actors.
Right.
So I think we're going to see a lot of formal influence of China. We'll see a lot of formal influence in Latin America, but it's the informal influence. It's the bribery, the corruption, the nepotism, all of that stuff that Chinese negotiators, for some reason, tend to be better at than
they have a bit of experience.
I'm not sure why, but they tend to be better at it than people from the US or Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
so we're going to be running into, so that the subtext here is just because you're leaving China doesn't necessarily mean you're leaving the China supply chain. You're going to see a lot of Chinese companies and a lot of Chinese practices follow you across the Pacific to Mexico and Latin America. And that's a concern. But what I will say is in Mexico, you do have greater legal protection and greater legal standing just because the government of Mexico is so sensitive about that USCMA or TMEC treaty. Mm-hmm. They need that, and they're not going to jeopardize it. So that's going to keep BRI at bay in Mexico, but it's not going to help with your other problems of bad laws being passed by the United States. The United States, we have the Monroe Doctrine, which no one's talked about for 40 years. But the Monroe Doctrine was this informal U.S. declaration that Latin America was part of the U.S. sphere of influence. And the MAGA people are talking about the Monroe Doctrine again. And this is just a huge warning bell for anyone in Latin America. They do not like hearing about the Monroe Doctrine. That is that is the remember when China had the century of humiliation and it was carved up into the spheres of influence. That's how Latin Americans view the Monroe Doctrine.
Oh, I see. We want our freedom, basically. Don't come and tell us what to do. We want to do what we want, and if we want to do business with China, we do business with China. Yeah. But the
United States has a terrible reputation here. The United States, the government here has a terrible, terrible reputation because of its history of interfering with domestic politics, both in terms of things like the Monroe Doctrine, but internally, the CIA fomenting coups and interfering with local governments and local elections. We're not, the United States is not beloved here, but the government leaders have partitioned. They differentiate between the government, the politics, and the business. China used to do this, but now U.S. and China are not separating business from politics, and that is what's that's why we're talking on the podcast here today.
Right. Yeah, China doesn't tend to differentiate anyway. In general, yes, it's one big relationship, and everything falls together, right? Okay.
Well, the party, boys. It's all about the party.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's been quite interesting. We're running out of time soon, so where can people hear more about your analysis and your descriptions about the Mexican business environment and economy and so on?
Okay, the best place to go is my podcast, Globalism 2.0, or just globalism2.com. That is where I've been. All my ideas and theories about the future of globalism are there. Lately, though, I've been focusing more on an old course of mine, business environment analysis, and I'm on the podcast Globalism 2.0. I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 weeks doing a business environment analysis on Mexico, focusing on what I call the China Pats, people like me and you who have all our business experience in China, how we go about setting up a new operation or expanding our existing operation into a new market that isn't part of the China or Asia business model, where it's completely different. So Globalism 2.0 or globalism2.com for that. And on LinkedIn, it's the best place to follow me because that's where I post and that's where I am writing. And I'm thinking about starting a course, an online course on business environment analysis that would be open, focusing on China Pats. So if people have interest in that, in a course on business environment analysis, focusing on Mexico and then Latin America, find me at globalism2@gmail.com, or find me on LinkedIn, Andrew Hupert, H-U-P like Peter, E-R-T, and connect with me on LinkedIn, and we will discuss the upcoming course.
Great. We'll include the few links that you mentioned in the show notes so people can find you easily. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was really a great pleasure. So let's see how all of these things develop. And
let's see. Maybe, hopefully, I'll see you in Hong Kong sometime, but maybe you'll see me in Mexico City.
Correct. Yes. All right. Thanks a lot, Andrew. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share because it will really help others discover us too.